1929, the Great Depression, the latest in our series of webinars on American history. We've been going forward chronologically from 1620 and the Mayflower, and now we've hit the Great Depression, a somewhat less euphoric event. I am delighted to have as our panelists today three very distinguished scholars whose works I am not going to list entirely because there will be much of their bibliography and web addresses for books on Amazon will be available in the chat button, I believe, below. So I'll just say briefly. Dr. Alexander Field is Michel and Mary Orradre Professor of Economics at Santa Clara University, extraordinarily distinguished career, including writing works such as A Great Leap Forward, 1930s Depression and U.S. Economic Growth. Professor Amity Shlaes, author of several New York Times bestsellers, including The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, Coolidge, a full-length biography of the 30th president, and she's also chair of the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. Dr. Peter Temin is Elisha Gray II Professor Emeritus of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and among his many books, ranging, I should say, from the ancient world, the Roman market economy onwards, but most relevantly for this presentation, Lessons from the Great Depression. Now, we're going to be talking in particular about, well, the economic aspects of the Great Depression. What made the Great Depression such a difficult slump to climb out of? How did the Great Depression shape the character of those who lived through it? What effects did this have on political and economic life in the forthcoming decades? These have been the prompts for our three scholars, who will each be giving perhaps 12 to 14-minute talks, which will be followed by comment, and that comes ideally from you. If you would please put your comments either in the chat button at the bottom or the Q&A button at the bottom, I will then relay them during our moderation time, or I may also add a few questions of my own. They won't be done in chronological order. They're simply going to be done in the order I figure makes for good conversation. I may add a question to my own as I say. This is going to be recorded for perpetuity on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. You will be able to look at this forever. If any questions don't get answered, send email to me, randall@nas.org. Afterwards, I will be happy to forward your questions to our panelists. So do not worry about a question not getting answered. Having said that, we're going in alphabetical order by last name. Dr. Alexander Field, if you would be so kind.
Well, thank you very much, David, for the introduction. It's very nice to see Peter and Amity here today. I'm going to try to share some PowerPoint slides with you. And also just heads up, I'm going to be talking more about the supply side effects of the Great Depression. I think both Peter and Amity will be focusing on more of the demand side. And of course, that's what traditionally has been focused upon in discussions about the Great Depression. So I guess I'm just going to get a thumbs up. I hope everybody can see this. I think, as David said, I've spent the last 20 years basically working on the supply side consequences, productivity growth during the second quarter of the 20th century. My work on the Great Depression is reflected first, I think, initially in my 2003 AER article, and then, as David mentioned, in this 2011 book here. And I think we can start by asking, what's the image on the cover of this? These are people at the General Motors Futurama exhibit at the 1939 40s World's Fair, and they're contemplating a diorama, a vision of the U.S. economy in 1960. And so the question I begin with is, why are they almost jumping off their seats? Why are they looking so intently here? And my answer is that in spite of the hardships of the Depression, they actually have, over the past decade, witnessed spectacular improvements in technological and organizational knowledge, which has already translated into significant improvements in living standards, and looking forward with great anticipation to what the next couple of decades will bring. And so the kind of perhaps surprising message of that book was that behind a backdrop of double-digit unemployment, potential output was growing by leaps and bounds between 29 and 41, and in fact was what helped make possible the successful prosecution by the United States of the Second World War and the golden age of American living standard improvement. One of the key arguments is that the supply side foundations of the golden age between 48 and 73 are not produced by the Second World War, but in fact were in place already in 1941. Okay, so I'm going to skip over some of this technical stuff because I only have a few minutes just to share with you some of the canonical images that we associated with the Great Depression, the stock market crash in 1929, a run on a bank here, It's a Wonderful Life and all that, although that was an SNL. People lining up at a labor exchange trying to get a job, looking for some free coffee and donuts, soup kitchen, Hooverville, outside of most major and many minor American cities, Okies, Grapes of Wrath, leaving from the Dust Bowl to try to go to California, where they'll be blocked by state troopers, but they're looking for a better life out here. And I don't want to trivialize any of that. Look, I mean, real GDP fell by almost 30% between 29 and 33, and the stock market collapsed. And this double-digit unemployment, of course, for more than a decade represented a terrible waste of human and other resources and untold hardships for the millions of people out of work. And yet, the Depression years were in fact a triumph of American ingenuity, inventiveness, and hard work, fueled by a remarkable explosion of R&D, government infrastructure investment, a build out of the surface road network, hydro investments, and creative responses to adversity. Scientific, technical, and organizational knowledge expanded the capabilities, the potential output of the economy, and that's a major part of what helped us win the war and set the stage for a quarter century of post-war prosperity. It's in part why the United States stood astride the world economy in 1948 like a colossus. High prosperity, high post-war growth rates in Europe. Japan represented catch-up to the US as a leader. Now, I always love this particular image because I think it captures the Janus-like character of the Great Depression. At the bottom, we see a line of individuals. I don't know whether they're lining up maybe for some food or whatever, mostly Black citizens. And in the top, we see a billboard advertising the world's highest standard of living. The slogan is, "There's no way like the American way." Nice family there, a couple of kids, little doggy leaning out the window, a car, probably a late model car. I think people forget that by 1937, automobile production was closing in on 1929 levels. It was about 95%. So anyway, we see the twin pictures of the Great Depression. And I think one of our problems perhaps is we've devoted too much emphasis. I shouldn't say that. I won't say too much, but I think I will make the factual statement that the bulk of our economic and cultural studies have focused on the output gap, not the growth of economic potential. So anyway, just again, to try to cut to the chase, what's the explanation for this? And so I emphasized three tributaries. Number one is the maturing of a privately funded R&D system that had begun with Thomas Edison and Menlo Park. Number two, spillovers from the government-funded build-out of the surface road network and infrastructure. And number three, I think this is of lesser importance, the kick in the rear of adversity that generated creative responses in sectors like railroads. Okay, so let me just start with I have a large discussion in the book about growth accounting. I'm not going to go through that here. The basic idea is really quite simple. What we try to do is look at the gap between the growth of real output and a weighted average of the growth of the two key inputs, hours and services from the capital stock. And here's the basic story for 29 to 41. Hours in 41 are basically in the private non-farm economy about what they were in 29. The capital stock has dropped between 29 and 33, but it's come back to 41. It's about at the same level, at least private sector. So it doesn't really matter how we weight these growth rates. However we weight 0 and 0, it's going to be 0. But in 1941, real output is somewhere between 33 and 40% higher than it was in 1929, depending on whether you use chain-weighted measures. And so on an annual basis, total factor productivity is growing somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. That's the entire explanation, basically, for real output growth. I also want to share with you these numbers on the remarkable growth of research and development employment. These are from National Research Council surveys. We see between 27 and 33, the numbers growing from about 6,300 to about 11,000. And then between 33 and 40, during another 7 years of double-digit unemployment, R&D workers growing from about 11,000 to 28,000. If you were a chemist during the Great Depression, you had an insurance policy against being unemployed. I can assure you of that. And then again, to cloak these numbers in some more kind of personal sense, I thought, hey, take a quick look at 3 innovators during the 30s who made a difference. We've got Wallace Carruthers, the inventor of nylon here. DuPont lures him away from Harvard in 1934 and 37. He gets the patent for nylon and its manufacturing process. Regrettably, it's a very sad story. A little more than 2.5 months later, he kills himself in a Philadelphia hotel room. But on May 14th, 1940, DuPont rolls out nylon stockings. It sells 63 million pair the first year, and 41 is also a good year before the output is devoted to producing mosquito netting and parachutes. We've got Philo T. Farnsworth, inventor of the first all-electronic television system. He's basically backed by San Francisco venture capital. He dispenses with the mechanical nip-cow discs, which had characterized all earlier prototypes. In 31, David Sarnoff at RCA offers to buy Farnsworth patents. Provided he becomes an RCA employee, Farnsworth refuses. As a decade-long patent battle, he wins. RCA is forced to license the patents. Commercial television is rolled out at the 3940 New York World's Fair, the same one that I feature on the cover of the book. TV cameras based on Farnsworth's design are used until the early 2000s, when CCDs began to replace them. Here's the nip-cow disc. It was a very crude device, scanned an image, and the different light intensities were converted to electrical signals, which could be transported across space and then reconstituted. Here's an RCA TRK-12 from 1939. You can see the CRT tube mounted vertically, a 45-degree mirror. You looked straight into it in terms of watching it. Here's the World's Fair. These are the back of a bunch of RCA TRK-12s. People kind of marveling at this new technological innovation. Here's a horizontally mounted CR2. Here's the Trilon and Perisphere. You are having some initial, sometimes during the day, commercial broadcasts in the New York area. Finally, Donald Douglas, inventor of the DC-3. He finishes at MIT in 1914, immediately appointed an assistant professor. In 21, he starts his own company. In the 30s, he begins working on the DC-3, a plane which is introduced in 1936. Here's a picture of United Airlines DC-3, over 16,000 produced, an additional 10,000 C-47s. Here he is talking with FDR. And then just finishing up here, there were many lesser known other innovators who improved products from the 1920s. And I want to take just a minute or so to focus on refrigerators, because that becomes a commodity product during the 1930s and reflective of the fact that in spite of the double-digit unemployment, material living standards are improving. First of all, in the 1920s, people said they had an ice box. That's generally what they meant. They had a box that had ice in it. There was a whole infrastructure for distributing ice to keep food cold. In the 1920s, mechanical refrigerators were an expensive, trouble-prone boutique product, a bleeding edge product produced by small companies requiring extensive aftermarket service. Less than 3% of households owned them. Here's one from the 1920s. It became a commodity product in the 30s. Here's an assembly line of refrigerators being produced in the 1930s. Here's a 1941 GE refrigerator. By 1940, 44% of US households had mechanical refrigeration, 56% of urban households. And again, I guess what I was trying to say is that this diffusion of this new consumer durable is one manifestation of the fact that if you kept your job during the Depression, your real hourly wages went up, and quite substantially. Your living standard improved at a rate at least equal to what happened in the post-war period. Again, I don't want to trivialize the fate of all the people in the construction sector and the many people who did remain out of work. Okay, and automobiles, again, 30s a major decade for improvement in the performance and quality of vehicles. Here's a 29 DeSoto. I won't go through all the specifics because we don't have the time here. 41 Plymouth, 41 Buick here. You can talk about some of the innovations that are introduced during the 1930s, much more innovative than during the 1950s, and all sorts of innovations also in industrial engineering, which contributed to productivity advance. Okay, well, I'm going to try to wrap this up here. I guess also just a second tributary was the build out of the surface road network. People think about the interstate as having been a big contribution. It's easy to fault or denigrate the build out of the US route system. I'm sorry, the US route system. Basically, a map of the US route system was agreed upon in November of 1926, and then they started building. You see a little dip in the early 30s, but they kept on building, and basically it's complete by 1941. You begin to see in some areas in the late 30s the first controlled access freeways, Pennsylvania Turnpike here, the Pasadena Freeway in 1940, Golden Gate Bridge, of course, big decade for bridge and tunnel construction. San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, the George Washington Bridge, Lincoln Tunnel, of course, in Hydro, the Hoover Dam. And then again, railroads, this was the third tributary. Again, I don't want to argue that adversity is necessarily beneficial for productivity advance. I think it was to some degree coincidental, but the railroad sector was one area where the kick in the rear, if you like, of the Depression did lead to organizational and institutional reorganization, which contributed to productivity growth and its role during the Second World War. So I think I'm going to stop at this point. Again, kind of the basic message in terms of my research on the Great Depression, it is that the growth of potential output between 29 and 41, which is obscured by the double-digit unemployment, which characterizes that period, it is what is laying the foundation not only for success during the Second World War, but also in terms of the post-war period. And if people are interested in the extension of this story into the Second World War period, I do have a new book coming out with Yale this year on the economic consequences of US mobilization for the Second World War. So just a little bit of a tease of that, and I will stop at this point. So thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. Wonderful to hear that. Professor Shlaes. Oh, and you're still muted.
How's that?
Lovely.
Better.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here and to be with Professor Field and Professor Temin, whom I have long admired. I've never been classed as a demand sider before, Professor Field, so this will be fun. I did rely on Professor Field's work for my work on the 1920s, which was the gestation of the productivity he describes, and I'm relying on it even more for a book I'm now writing about the economic growth and innovation pre-World War I. So I'm excited about World War II, but I'm also excited about your preceding work, and likewise Professor Temin's. In a session like this, we tend to look at, do you have my image up? You can put it up if you want. Or in a session like this, we tend to look at history from on high and through theory. Usually we think of life being moving this way: theory, application of theory, period of lag, result, analysis of theory, review. And that's the way the human mind works. That's the way governments work, and they have their place. But I want to actually mention the COVID situation. Think about how we think about COVID policy and COVID events. We don't experience COVID in the aggregate, really. We experience it individually in real time. We say, what is happening in my town is, what happened to my sister was, what happened to me is, what I heard about the vaccine was. That is, we experience situations individually, and we see, we tend to be very humble, then say our authority is just the authority of individual anecdote. What I discovered in looking at the Great Depression is there's a merit to that individual experience, and we who write books tend to overlook that. It's bottom up, it's unedited, it correlates to reality in real time. So it may get us to collective wisdom faster, in fact. Whether that wisdom, even after a result is evident, becomes received wisdom is a second question. And that second question is generally decided by politics. Sometimes politics or policymakers reject the common man's evidence, aggregates conclusions. I think you can think about it this way. Think about the question of ventilators in the early COVID period. Pretty quickly, some doctors and certainly some patients figured out the ventilators weren't saving lives as they might do. It took a while for that to become received wisdom. And the Depression was a bit like that. We're talking about the Great Depression and a policy called the New Deal. And our topic really is, how did policy and theory perform? So I'll use my 8, 9, 10 minutes to answer that by going down to the very small level, to the micro, and talk about several individuals, brothers, and their experience, and then talk about theory in that context. And that is why I have that picture up there. What I choose to speak about is a very small business, an immigrant business of a poultry wholesaler in an immigrant neighborhood, a business of several brothers. Their name was Schechter. They lived in Brooklyn. A little bit of background on their own sense of authority and where they came from. Schechter actually means butcher in the language that is their mother tongue. So they're very proud to be butchers, and they operate in a world that has plenty of rules that govern their business, rules from what they regard as, let's say, as in the kosher hot dog ads, the highest authority. Their business is kosher, so it behooves them, it's mandatory for them to follow the dietary law and folk ways of the old village and their community. They don't work on the Sabbath, which for them would be Saturday. They have a bunch of other rules in their culture. One is to allow the customer to pick his chicken. And there are good reasons for that, vis-a-vis Professor Field's presentation, because they come out of the teens, the 20s, and the early 30s when there wasn't refrigeration as the rule always, and certainly the days before antibiotics. So the customer wants assurance he has a healthy animal. If you're detecting a poultry theme in my remarks, yes, it is there. In this particular business, there are also heavy penalties. What happens to the Schechters in their community? If they displease their community, they are not only disapproved of, they are excommunicated. The merchant loses his market. We know that in the Schechter case, these butchers were the children of a man who called himself a rabbi, which meant he was serious. And that meant if they broke rules, their father might deny their very existence. What else is their context? They operated in Brooklyn in the early 30s. The Depression is on. 1/3 of the businesses in their class, which is the wholesale live poultry market, are failing. And as Alexander suggested, there's a tech challenge confronting them existentially as well. They are a live poultry market. They kill the chicken right there, as in the old country. Refrigeration would be a Schumpeterian threat, a disruptive technology to them, and a new kind of company, a new kind of shop. The supermarket also threatens their very business model. So you want to imagine them struggling along in this context, in the Great Depression. They don't have Twitter. They barely speak English. What news they do get is in another language with another alphabet. And to them, the Roosevelt administration, which they probably support, and the New Deal are very far away. Then one day when they're in Brooklyn, a health officer, maybe with an official badge, an inspector appears at their door and asks questions about their business. What do they pay their butchers? How many hours do the butchers work? What do the butchers wear when they work? What is the health of the hens that they sell? How do the butchers at Schechter determine which customer gets which chicken? And what is the sticker in the window? Is it really there? Can they confirm? They're very confused, the way you're confused when something like a pandemic hits you. They vaguely know they're supposed to have a sticker that says they're part of the New Deal, like a Vax Pass. Everyone has to have them. The sticker has to have a bird image on it because it's the blue eagle symbol of the National Recovery Administration, a new entity created by New Deal law by President Roosevelt, whose industry code applies to them. This is really how people experience economic regulation, as in Kafka, usually. Policy is far away until it happens to you. And they notice this inspector, whose name happened to be Philip Lampy, is writing them up as a case. And they're worried they're going to get in trouble. And the inspector says, we know this from the court testimony, you might get a fine. And now I will put on the Brooklyn as they spoke. The inspector said, just pay the fine and everything will be hotsy-totsy. The context for this is that Franklin Roosevelt, governor of New York, had campaigned for president, promising to help the forgotten man, the man at the bottom of the pyramid. And he had promised bold, persistent experimentation from above based on certain economic theories. And the National Recovery Administration, with its special eagle, was the centerpiece of Roosevelt's New Deal, his program. That entity, the NRA with the eagle, was essentially assigned to regulate the economy back to health, with the assumption being the process would restore unemployment to 5% from 25%. And there are a number of premises underlying this new regulatory, it was a large one, behemoth, kind of a ministry of magic, to put it in Harry Potter terms. What were the rules that were the basis for the operation? What was the philosophy of the NRA tasked with bringing the economy back? One was that low wages hurt the economy because the lower earner has less to spend, demand side, and therefore cannot buy and stimulate the economy. So wages have to go up. That is not optional. Companies must raise wages. Long hours hurt the economy because then one job is held by one man and we need to share jobs when there's unemployment. Another principle of this NRA applied to the Schechters was that the economy of scale is very important. Hours should be standardized. Therefore, a shop with odd hours, even a shop that has odd hours that are odd because they're customary in their ethnicity, that shop needs to be brought in line. Another principle was that consumer choice takes time and therefore prevents recovery. This was a very hot principle in the period. It's not intuitive to us now, Starbucks customers as we are, but then they believe by and large that every business has to move fast like a Henry Ford assembly line. And the Schechters had ignored these rules. And now they can ignore them and they're in trouble. And perhaps you know the feeling if you've ever interacted with US tax authorities, you're convicted before you're convicted and you're not even sure of what. The Schechters had more than 50 indictments against them, criminal indictments of breaking the rules of the NRA, which they scarcely understood. It was definitely like Kafka, convicted before you know the law. Their books and the inspector's papers, whatever he wrote up about them, proved them guilty in the eyes of the law. They were convicted of paying too little. They were convicted of having they were accused of having their workers work the wrong hours. It was alleged they sold poultry unfit for human consumption. They had allowed customers to pick chickens and they were very upset. That was their response, especially with the sick chicken charge. This became known as the sick chicken case across America because they knew if they sold a sick chicken, they would be indeed disowned by their own community. When you go back and look at their trial in court, they were first in lower court. The government's case is shaming them for not understanding about economics. Did you not know you needed 2 vaccines? But the equivalent then from the New Deal, the government attorney said, how can you not follow these rules? You must not be an economist. Are you an economist? That's what the prosecutor asked the Schechters. No, we're not economists. We're just little chicken people. But after a while, during their case in court, the Schechters and their friends began to fight back a little bit. And they said, I may not be an economist, one of them, but I am an economizer. I know how to run a business, and I know that I can't follow all of the rules. I can't pay a very high wage when I don't have very high revenues in my business. The point of this poultry story, which happened, this case was in 1934 and 1934, also comes out. Much of the policy applied by the New Deal was illogical and got in the way of small business and impeded recovery. The vague big theory of economy of scale didn't work at all for them. And the government rules in the national emergency didn't entirely make sense, even for people such as the Schechters, who were supporters of Franklin Roosevelt. I'll close out now by saying, as you probably know, the sick chicken case did become famous. It went to the Supreme Court, and the High Court sided with the little chicken butchers, and even kind of enjoying the poultry metaphor, it said that the centerpiece of the New Deal, the National Recovery Administration, must fall. Some of the court's decisions, of course, were constitutional. That's how the Supreme Court operates. But it was also very clear, if you go back and look at this case, and I think anyone interested in economics should, that the justices also brought out that the new emergency agency was insisting upon policies that didn't make economic sense. So the little chicken in the story, this small business, happened to prevail over the eagle, the centerpiece of the New Deal. Why did I tell this story? Because it's one of the many stories I found when I went back to look at the 1930s. Two others I address in my book, but can't today for time, are that arbitrary intervention to adjust the value of currency, and I know Peter will get into this, is problematic for recovery, general uncertainty generated by a flamboyant administration, scaring business, also impedes recovery. Writ large, the conclusion of my book is that intervention put the Great in the Great Depression. A bunch of Schechter stories turns into an aggregation of data points. And the aggregate data points tell you that unemployment, as Alexander mentioned, stayed above 10% for the entire decade. And often it was above 15%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average did not come back to the 29 high. And I think that's disturbing, even when you discount for, say, deflation, which did occur. The error was that the top did not consider sufficiently what was going on in real time. The top, the government, wanted to leisurely test its theories. It wanted to appear to be doing something. And I will close with one quote, which I think also applies to some of the problems we're looking at today. It's a complaint by one New Dealer describing another. The New Dealer who wrote this complaint was a man named Ray Moley. He said to a person in the government, but also I think he was speaking about the government generally, the problems of economic life were litigious, confrontational, not broadly constructive or evolutionary. The government was the protagonist. Its agents were its lawyers and commissioners. The antagonists were big corporations. In the background were misty principles, vague figures whom the colleague never knew firsthand and who were chiefly envisaged as concepts in legalistic fencing. Those background figures were owners of corporations, managers, workers, and consumers. The utility in this point is that we can never forget the smaller part of the story, the small figure, and often we can learn about the nature of a period or crisis from that small person much better. In the New Deal, as lovable as it was, the president who promised to help the forgotten man forgot the forgotten man, did not employ him. And that truth comes out best when you look at not only the data at top, but also the stories at the bottom.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, I think you're over now, or?
Yep.
Yes, lovely. Okay, sorry. Just make sure I'm not cutting you off. Thank you so much. And we'll now go to our third and concluding panelist, Dr. Temin.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. After two valuable introductions about the supply side and how productivity implied due to the in productivity in the 1930s, and another one on government regulation of all of this activity in the New Deal, which also took place in the 1930s. Let me back up and try to give you a narrative of why we even explored all of these things in the interwar period, interwar period. And it starts from something that will seem very abstract to most of you, with the gold standard. And as many of you know, I guess at the moment with COVID floating around, nobody travels internationally. But if you do, you discover that if you want to get a newspaper or something else in another country, that then you have to think very seriously about what the exchange rate is. To get a hotel room, you have to convert it as to what it is with the current exchange. The gold standard was something invented in the 19th century to make this much easier. And it's called the gold standard. And that is that all developed countries would assign a gold value to their currency. And then they would have an agency that would buy and sell the gold, buy and sell the currency in gold to keep it at that price. And so that was the gold standard. And as I say, it required a kind of discipline of the countries in order to maintain this, because if there were too many people trying to sell your currency because people got scared of your currency for one reason or another, you might not be able to maintain the value. And then you would have to devalue your currency. Now, that worked well for many years. But the First World War was a huge shock to the economic system. And it was a shock that was made worse by the Versailles Treaty that ended the war, which imposed sanctions on the Germans for causing the war. Okay, so I'll get a little closer to the microphone. Okay, so this was a great shock to the economy of the world, of the developed world, although it had implications. So sad things happening elsewhere too. For that, and it was very strained. Okay. And so the World War I was a huge shock to the system, but every developed country, US, UK, France, Germany, tried to get back on their old gold value. The problem is that conditions had changed. because of the impact of the war. And so it was very hard for them to keep it. And what happened in the Depression, and I'll come back in a few minutes to the events that caused the Great Depression. But you can see a sense of why maintaining the pre-value gold standard was such a dividing thing and a causal cause of the deep depression that countries have. That in 1931 had they abandoned the gold standard. And as a result, England had a much milder depression than the rest of the developed world. Okay, so that's the whole point about the context. Now, what comes the depression was a product of the United States going very ahead. Or let me back up just a minute and say the Depression was started by two events in 1929 and 1932. The first one was in the United States. The second one was in Germany. Okay, that kind of sets the stage for this world theory of what was going on. So in World War I, we had a recession after the war, and then we had about a half a decade of rather furious economic activity, which started all of the activities in the other lectures here, just leave it there. Okay, and the boom kind of got out of hand, and so it had a stock market crash in 1929. And as you all know, probably who have heard this there, for all of this period, that was the depression of the Great Depression. But it was turned from a simple stock market crash, like the 2008 stock market crash. It was given a further stimulus downward by Germany. You recall that I said that the Versailles Treaty that ended the war, the First World War, imposed reparations on the Germans for starting the war. Well, the Germans by 1930 were quite the same Germans as had started the war, but they had suffered also from the stock market crash, and they were endeavoring to get out of it. They were endeavoring to borrow money from the French banks in order to deal with their recession. But they were having trouble with it and with paying the reparations. They had their domestic problem and they had their foreign problems. And so what happened was that the German prime minister said, well, I think I can deal better with the domestic problems if I don't have to pay the recession. The word I'm doing, the penalties imposed by the victors in the First World War. And so he let that be known. And then the French banks said, oh my God, if you're going to get out of these commitments, we're not going to lend to you, because they were in the victors' things. And so the Reichsbank began to lose value because they couldn't do it. And this led the German stock market to lose money and the German banks to have a run. And so the Reichsbank increased the discount rate by 2 percentage points. To put that in current context, the head of the Federal Reserve at the moment is toying with raising this the rate by 0.25%. So this was very huge and led the United States. Then the Federal Reserve increased its interest rate by 2%, following the German example and giving the world economy another push downward. Okay, so everything was going down, and Hoover was an adherent of the gold standard and really couldn't think of what to do for this. There have been biographies of Hoover explaining that he was a very good technology expert of the topics just discussed by the previous speakers, but he didn't know what to do about boosting the economy. So there was an election in 1932, and Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the winner. And he took office in the spring of 1933. It was in March as opposed to January when it is now. They changed it to January because of this long delay between the election and when Roosevelt could start off. And Roosevelt was, first of all, not so tuned to the gold standard, and second of all, a very good communicator to his audience. And so everybody knows the phrase, we must not get into fear, for fear itself depresses business. So he was faced with a bank failure at this point, which he called a bank holiday. That you can see his framework for all of this, and then recovered each blank that was legal. And then he started to revive industry by setting out the framework that was discussed in the last lecture, the New Deal. And he'd had trouble with the Supreme Court doing this. So he ran for re-election in 1936 and was elected. So he threatened to enlarge the Supreme Court. Before he could get around to this, the Supreme Court said, implicitly, but in their decisions, we'll go along with you at this point. So the whole idea of having new justices on the Supreme Court dates from this action. And he passed the New Deal to help the ordinary people to get ahead. And so that's the New Deal. There was a New Deal for business, New Deal for consumers. It was a well-founded thing there. It was also a newfound for modern drug regulation that we're all subject to later on, and for Social Security, which now the older people here get. And so we recovered, as the two lectures have said, to a wave of productivity in the 1930s, in which things improved greatly for that. Alas, with a minor exception of 1937, when things got out of hand again. But we had a recession, but it was a V-shaped. It went down, 37 came back up in 38. And so this was the account of the Great Depression, which led there to be continuous unemployment. One of the things that Roosevelt did was to get help even for artists. And so we have a lot of art that came from the Great Depression. And his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, tried to help very much the African American people, but alas, she didn't get very much time and get much progress. And so we were ready, as the first lecture said, to fight the world in the Second World War, which I often refer to as the second part of the same war, because it was the Allies against the Germans twice over, with a little peaceful but eventful transition, peaceful transition in the middle. And then, since people can advertise their new books, let me advertise a book that gets on the new problems with our race. And I see it as a successor to my successful book, The Vanished Middle Class, that in the post-war period, when the Republicans got into power under Nixon and Romer, they started a part of a drug war to scare the African Americans who are not for the wars that they want to fight. And so we've had a mass incarceration problem since then, which defames the right of blacks. So I've written a book called Never Together, the economic history of a segregated America. And that's coming out from Cambridge University Press on March 31st, held up by the supreme supply problems at this moment. It used to be coming out by now, but it has delayed due to supply problems for that. So I urge you to buy it and to read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. Now, there are a bunch of questions, and I'm going to, I think, boldly ignore some of them just for fun to ask a question which I might get some of your different talks together. But I will encourage people to continue, put in questions in the chat, in the Q&A. I wanted to start with Dr. Field talking about in great investment in productivity and so on. So this is a multi-part question for the three of you. One, where did the companies get the money to invest in productivity growth in the middle of the Great Depression when so much else was going wrong? Two, did monetary policy, gold standard up to 33, going off it after that, inhibit or help in the different standards this increase in productivity growth? And then three, did government policy aid or hinder or both productivity growth during the Great Depression? So I'm trying to get all three of you to answer something, your different specialties all coming together. And I guess Dr. Field first, in particular, where did the money come from? If you also wanted to answer the other two.
It does not seem to, I mean, obviously there was, tremendous disruption in the banking and financial system prior to 1933. I think with what Peter talked about in terms of the abandonment of the gold standard and the essentially revision of inflationary expectations, that's critical, I think, in terms of what Roosevelt was able to achieve. Prices have been dropping at about 8% a year between 29 and 33. They rose at about 1% a year between 33 and 37. And frankly, in terms of real growth, 33 to 37, an extraordinary period of real growth. It's largely the closing of the output gap. But I don't have any sense looking, for example, at Douglas or Farnsworth, who was financed by venture capital, or any of these innovators, that was a particular problem if they had a good idea. So I don't really see that as inhibiting that after 1933. Now you had a couple of other questions. Maybe I'll let Peter or Amity tackle the other questions, and I come back to it since we have limited time.
Okay, let me just second Professor Field has said. After the bank holiday, the banks recovered. And with the framework of the New Deal, as discussed in the other lecture, they were happy to invest with the result that Professor Field has described.
Let me just add one more thing. I mean, a lot of the innovations in the 1930s did not necessarily involve enormous capital improvements. For example, a lot of the instrumentation and some kind of technological improvements are just better recipes. They save capital as well as save labor. So I think that's a lot of what was going on there. Again, in terms of whether government policy helped or hurt, whether the Depression helped or hurt, to be honest, I think a lot of what happened during the during the 1930s in terms of this extraordinary record of productivity advance had to do with the simultaneous cresting of a number of technological paradigms that were ripe for exploitation. And a lot of that, of course, it's hard to do counterfactual history, probably would have happened without the Great Depression. So I am not attributing the productivity advance by and large to the Great Depression. I am simply stating that it was an important aspect of that particular time period.
Another way of, I think, Dr. Field, of saying what you're saying is what went before the 20s was an incredible explosion of innovation. If you look at the patent rate for the 20s, it's very high. It's still studied. So those ideas were there. The idea of television was there, which is why there are debates about whether RCA stock, which was extremely high, was actually at the end of the 20s was actually priced right, an advanced expression of the incredible value in the commercialization of television that would come later. There were no TV sets in American homes in 1929. There was just sort of a bunch of ideas that turned into commercialized television 10 and 20 and 30 years later. All that happened in the 20s. And I think it's valuable for us to look at the policy of the 20s, which was extremely friendly to innovation. What are the components of friendship to innovation? Stabler money, apropos Professor Temin, a respect for business. What happened in the 30s very often was antagonism to business. Roosevelt himself, lovable as he was, and he was, really vilified business quite often. He vilified the man who electrified Chicago, Samuel Insull, so thoroughly that none of us has ever heard of Insull, even though some of us are from Chicago. As Forrest McDonald wrote in his interesting history of Sam Insull's electric grid in Chicago. So all this was happening in the 20s. Tax policy was friendly. Innovation policy was friendly. There weren't large antitrust actions predominant in the 20s. And it was a very hopeful, growthy period. Productivity, as Professor Field teaches, happens with a lag. We saw that in the 80s and 90s too. We got computers, and I used to sit in editorial board meetings at the Wall Street Journal, and the data just did not suggest that we were having huge productivity gains. And the editors would say, well, where's the productivity? And the economists, right, correctly, would say, it's coming. There's a lag that will show up in the data. So the 30s were in some ways the lag result of the 20s. He also points out, which I second, the incredible value of adversity. No one would wish adversity on anyone, but sometimes adversity brings out incredible energy in people. When a business is in survival mode, it will sometimes come up with an idea that is more innovative than what it was doing all along, just out of sheer necessity, being the mother of invention. Just sticking to that question, you, Professor Field, say, and I agree, that there are, and you too, I think, Professor Temin, say there are spillover effects when the government gets involved in a big project, say the highway in the 1950s or the railroad, or other road building. Then you get some efficiencies. If the government builds a highway, trucks can use it, to put it simply, which is what we saw. So their government policy in some ways was good. The structures built by the Works Progress Administration or the Public Works Administration, some of the New Deal structures were valuable to towns. Some of the roads that the emergency workers worked on were very important. Some of the parks were extremely beautiful. Of course, when government does something, it can be good. But by and large, I just want to say one final thing. If we can say a lot of wonderful growth and recovery happened in the 30s, but bottom line, and you can't explain this away with deflation, the stock market did not come back to its nominal 1929 level in the 30s or even the 40s. And that's appalling. What if we would say today, oh, we think we might be around 35,000 and it won't come back until our children are done with graduate school? We Americans don't expect that now. They expect the stock market to go up, and the unemployment cannot be got around it. It was terrible. Today, we would consider 1 in 10 people unemployed for 10 years a real disaster. And that was the experience of the policy in the 30s. So if you look at growth year over year, you can say how great the New Deal policy was, but most people don't look at growth year over year. They're not stock investors. They say, when do we get back to where we were in 29? And we did not get back to where we were before the unfortunate period commenced until many years, essentially after World War II. So I just want to say that the Great Depression was truly awful.
Can I just very, very quickly, Amity, I appreciate Appreciate all of that. And I would agree that some of what happened in the 30s represented an exploitation of a larder of unexploited opportunities and ideas in the 20s, but not all of it. And I think you have to look at those numbers in terms of R&D employment. You have to look at the numbers in terms of the actual changes in gross private domestic investment after 1933. You have to look at the fact that automobile production in 1937 is 95% of 1929. I mean, as you say, most people in the United States in the 1930s were not stock investors. Now, as far as unemployment, I would be the last person to dismiss that. I think it was a serious problem which was never remedied in the 1930s, and it was principally located in construction. Been huge construction booms during the 1920s in terms of the residential construction booms, apartments, then central business district. Central business district construction, you know, you look at places like LA or Boston and so on, you don't see skyscrapers coming back until the 1950s. So a large part of that remaining construction unemployment problem was just, you know, construction was in a terrible situation. You know, as far as diversity, as I said, yes, I do think it was a critical factor in the railroad industry in terms of reorganization and being able to ship things without freight interchange as you went across the country. But again, I'm a little skeptical of the argument about adversity being overall good for innovation. People say, well, you know, what doesn't hurt, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The unfortunate problem is that in a lot of situations it kills you. So I would certainly agree we can point to the 5% where it does lead to extraordinary innovations which benefit us all. But I don't think we want to lose sight of the other 95%. And I'll stop at that point. So thanks.
And I'm going to interrupt then with a question, well, taking a question from the audience, pushing it a little bit, from Shahid Zafar. He asks about management, and I want to push his question about management's contribution. Is there a distinct management revolution in the New Deal, which we should be talking about? And I guess I would break that into a private sector management revolution, and then of course a government management revolution, federal, state, local. So is there a distinct management revolution? Are the government and private management revolutions more alike or more dissimilar, and what are their different effects?
I think the most important management revolution in U.S. economic history was frankly in the last third of the 19th century. And it's what Alfred Chandler talks about in terms of the innovation of the modern business enterprise made possible by reliable all-weather transportation and communication. There's further spread of that certainly in the first part of the 20th century. I don't particularly see an enormous change in management in the 1930s. There's, you know, Berlin means in terms of separation from ownership control, but I haven't really studied that as closely as perhaps Amity has or Peter.
There's a wonderful film about the Empire. It starts with the Empire State Building, where and the Empire State Building went up very fast. It was one of those structures that was not there 1 year and was there pretty soon after. And there's a character in the film. It's a fiction film, but it's trying to capture the excitement where the engineer gets told to do something and he doesn't do it. And he says, no, that would be bad for the system. I'm not afraid for my job, i.e., I know what I'm doing and I would never pull the wrong switch just because a boss told me so. And as Professor Field says, you know, one of the things about the 30s was an increasing respect for people with strong technological knowledge. And I don't know if that's management or not, but an understanding that those who are educated in the area, say it would be an electrical engineer in the Empire State Building, have a lot to teach the rest of us. That was a new thing. And very exciting to see. What it suggests is that education is the way out of trouble, and a lot of us still believe that.
Yeah, I actually do think the Empire State Building was started in the 20s and was not finished until early in the 30s. So
no, but it's in the period the film takes place, right? It's 20s know-how plus political clout in New York, right? But it went up into the 30s, I believe. Am I wrong? Now I'm going to go look it up, but I believe it was in the Depression. It was still rising in that period. And this film is from the Great Depression period, and it conveys a lot Sir, just as your
We have
image of the
somebody from the
diorama
audience who's just posting and said it took 13 months. So it's
yeah, very
not
fast.
a critical. That is
Very fast.
relatively. Yeah, I mean, the 20s, look, there's enormous productivity advance in manufacturing during the 1920s. The difference between the 20s and the 30s is that almost all of the productivity advances coming out of manufacturing in the 1920s has to do with the internal replacement of the internal distribution of how power is distributed away from shafts and belts to electric current and wiring and small electric fractional horsepower motors. That continues to some degree in the 30s, but what's different about the 30s is you also have these very strong spillovers in wholesale and retail distribution from the build out of the surface road network. That was, I mean, Amity was mentioning the way road building was perhaps one of the beneficial features she does see in the Great Depression, and the bridges and tunnels and hydropower. That made a big difference. That was quite complementary to private business, not just in manufacturing, but also in terms of the extension of supermarkets and huge gains in the trucking industry in particular, which complemented railroads. That was all, I think, part of it. So you had that along with continued the remainder of the electrification of manufacturing. That's partly, I think, what underlies the strong advance during that decade.
Dr. Temin hasn't yet spoken to this question, this series of subjects. Do you have anything you would like to say?
I'm not quite sure what the question is at this point.
Well, it started out with management, but management revolution, but that may have been disposed of. If not, I actually would then go to a different question from the audience, Ray Sanchez, which again, I'm going to extend a little bit. You know, what influence did Keynes and Keynesian economics have on the experience of the Great Depression? You know, particularly since his general theory was written, published in 36. I'm going to extend that my understanding is that his book actually drew upon his perception of the experience of the Great Depression, and indeed on, Roosevelt's policy. So I would add to that, did he get the experience of the Great Depression accurately? Did he understand properly what Roosevelt was doing as it informed his general theory?
Okay, that's
Peter
a good
should answer
question.
that, yeah.
But Roosevelt met Keynes in the middle of the 30s. They didn't get along. So I think you can say that FDR's policies and the New Deal and all the things that people were talking about was independent of Keynes. Now, Keynes has had an enormous influence on post-World War II activity and invention, and on the management of the economy, so on. And there is the thing, and in fact, if you want to find out about it, I've written a very simple book, which is currently unavailable except at the MIT library. But it's just called Keynes by Peter Temin and David Vines. And that will tell you the essence of Keynesian thought.
Going back to, and I think to Amity's point about Hoover and what Roosevelt may have done in terms of fiscal stimulus. I mean, E. Cary Brown back in 1956, basically said it's not that Keynesian economics didn't work; it wasn't tried, and just the federal government was too small. And I accept that position. My emphasis is
that's still accepted among economists.
And overall on the supply side consequences of the road building may have been relatively small in terms of multipliers, in terms of bringing people back into employment and closing the output gap, but it had substantial effects in terms of improving the potential output of the economy. That's kind of been my position on it.
That's a good position.
You want me to the Keynes story is very funny because Keynes advised, we didn't have Keynesianism, so it's anachronism to force it, as Peter is saying. Keynes didn't quite have Keynesianism yet because he was still writing his big opus. But Keynes criticized the way Roosevelt handled going off the gold standard as the gold standard on the booze. And he wrote a very important letter, a public letter to Roosevelt later in the 30s, where he was taking issue with the way President Roosevelt went after big business as if he were hunting. And what Keynes wrote was, you can nationalize big business. We've done that before in Anglo-American history. You can leave big business alone. Big business is really like domestic animals. If you treat domestic animals all right, they give you meat and milk. But there's no use. What's the use in chasing business around the lot every other week? That is intermittently bullying business. It's a very funny letter that was published in the Times. Business is like a domestic animal. What's the use of chasing them around the lot every other week? But these are two powerful, charismatic men, Keynes of Britain and Roosevelt, the US president, and they were both quite theatrical. And what Roosevelt began to do, even if it wasn't on a large scale, came out of what you could call proto-Keynesian theory. I mean, there were kind of half crackpot people going around fostering catchings. I think the econ professors will remember them. And Roosevelt didn't believe them in the 20s, but by the time he got to the presidency in the 30s, he saw the political utility in spending and began to look for justifications for spending, not at first, but, 34, 35. And that's what Keynesianism is on a bad day, window dressing for expanding political power, an economic justification for expansion of political power. I need to spend to make the economy grow. And when I spend, I help the people and then they vote for me, which is basically the scenario in 36. Do you want to ask, why did Roosevelt win so great in 36 when unemployment still wasn't gone? The only answer is that one, he had a great spirit, but two, he rewarded every group systematically, building the template for both parties now, which is you reward groups and then they vote for you. You reward labor, you reward workers who are not in labor, you reward old people, Social Security, and then they'll vote for you. So Keynesianism was the economic excuse for that to some extent, or what became known as Keynesianism. And that's important to understand. Whether Keynes is right is one thing, whether he's abused by politicians is another.
Thank you. I am going to go building again on a question from a Jesse Brundage, who is asking about, in what ways did the New Deal government aid unions in attempts to increase countervailing power? I want to, push this again a bit. How important was New Deal policy toward unions in affecting overall economic growth? And what were the positive and negative effects of New Deal union policy on long-term economic growth in America?
Okay, I'll do that. In 1935, he proposed a law that legalized unions, which were formed in some of the industries Professor Field has talked about, so on, which led to workers striking and getting increase in wages. During the war, when prices were controlled, then firms that were producing for the war couldn't get more people by raising wages, which is what you would normally do, or what's happening now.
Nikolai.
Right. And so they put in benefits for them. which is the beginning of modern healthcare, which grew over the years into the healthcare system that we have for that. So in this period of rapid growth, up to about 1970, all the people benefited from it. Of course, people got killed in the war, and there's the wartime benefit of that. And then with possibly starting with Goldberg's bad run for the presidency, and then for Nixon attaining it. In Nixon, we began to divide, as we are totally divided today.
Dr. Field, Professor Shlaes?
One of the things that there's a professor named Lee Ohanian, who I got to know after The Forgotten Man was published, but we had the 1935 Wagner Act. It went into effect, and it really went into effect over a course of years. And it was a very pro-organized labor law, more pro than we have now. And what Dr. Ohanian says, and there's some data for that, is wages were real high in the 30s, which is completely counterintuitive. Not just because of the reason I mentioned for the Schechter story, which is the loss, but also because businesses were afraid of unions. Why they were afraid of unions? Because the administration was backing up the unions with the strong law, the Wagner Act, which was subsequent to the Wagner Act, was a real tiger. So imagine it was emasculated after World War II by Taft-Hartley. It was, our labor law today is much weaker than the Wagner Act. Unions ruled under the Wagner Act, and that did have a negative effect on unemployment in the later 30s. The fear of the businesses and the high wages that maybe businesses could not pay. And that's what Ohanian devotes his life work to. But there's a wonderful book that gives the story again from the bottom, kind of anecdotally, from an individual business, called Depression Diary by a businessman named Roth, who lived, I believe, in Toledo, where he basically says, and I'm paraphrasing, we don't know whether it was the threat of strikes or the mandated high wage, but something is making factories not want to invest as much as they could or significantly rehire as many as they otherwise might have done. That's definitely part of the culture of the later 30s. So you have a dramatic theatrical support for the scary labor union leader, John L. Lewis, and for organized industrial labor, specifically from the Roosevelt administration. And it went a bit overboard. And the economy and the populace saw that, which is why we got kind of a watering down subsequent to World War II.
I just think it's worth pointing out that between 1929 and 1933, gross private domestic investment fell 75% in real terms. And that was a period in which unions were relatively weak. So there obviously are other factors which are influencing that trend. And also there is a substantial revival. I think 38 unemployment goes up, from 15% to I think 19%. I mean, I think there are other factors besides Bob Higgs's view of the capital strike that are responsible, but reasonable people have different perspectives, trying to tease out what's responsible for these trends.
Okay, I am going to go to another question from the audience. This may be the last question. It's about the popularity of Roosevelt with the working class. I suppose, were they justified in liking him so much? Was there any false consciousness? What was he doing right for the working class, and what in the long run, perhaps not so great? But let's talking about this particular from the working class, the poor, not just the economy as a whole. what is their experience, their benefit, their loss from poor Americans, working Americans from the Great Depression, from the policies to the New Deal policies in particular to deal with the Great Depression?
I think there's a tremendous variation in the experience of people, who are, blue collar workers or working class or whatever you want to talk about. Some of them, benefited, I think, tremendously from the revival of the economy. But to Amity's point, the unemployment rate, even at the local peak in 1937, the Lieberkot numbers are still 15%. So you have, just many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people out of work. So I think for some people, the actions, particularly the abandonment of the gold standard, the resetting of inflationary expectations, which I think we know from today's experience is quite important. Once rapid deflation, as in after the First World War, that's quick and over, is not so much of a problem. It's when it persists. And even if you go to the zero lower bound, you're facing very substantial real interest rates, and that's a very big hindrance to revival. So I do think the revision, the move from 8% deflation per year from 29 to 33 to 1% inflation from 33 to 37 is significant in terms of reviving business investment and reviving, as I said, automobile production, if I remember correctly, is 95%, I think, of the 1929 levels by the local peak in 37. So some people are benefiting and other people are forgotten. They're left behind. And it does take essentially the Second World War to bring everybody to unimaginably low levels of unemployment. Now, it is, of course, true that we did ultimately have, 11 or 12 million people in uniform. So that played an important role in doing that.
I'll just say one thing. I think we get from our mothers all the way through graduate school told, well, it was really the war that ended the Depression. Kind of sometimes it's loud and sometimes it's soft. So my mother used to whisper to me, well, it was really World War II, all that spending. I think the relevant question for anyone interested in the 1930s is not how the war ended the Depression, which I would not even agree with. But why did that Depression last all the way to that war? Why do you have a decade that is lost to the American people and the economy, except for the productivity gains? Why do you have that much unemployment that long, the Dow down that long as well? And in our drive to always focus on the end of the war, of course, a massive amount of spending, and it was truly massive, the government spending. It goes from, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Alexander, but 10 or below to 20, 30, 40% of the economy when the war drive goes on. This is what Professor Field is writing about. That is like getting heroin after you've had nothing but tea for an economy. Of course, it felt good, but it's not a stable peacetime regime. So I don't think giant increases in spending are particularly relevant to countries that are generally in peace mode. What is troubling is that the recovery just didn't come all those years before.
I think in partial response to the question you raise, Amity, it is an issue I dealt with in an article in the 1990s. And in fact, it was a supply side explanation. Again, I come back to the failure of construction to revive really until after the Second World War. And I basically developed an argument saying it had to do with the legacy of premature subdivision during the residential housing boom of the 1920s. That's obviously not the whole story, but it is a part of the kind of supply side explanations in that case that I do think you have to introduce in terms of understanding why it persisted for so long.
And may I ask Dr. Temin, have you?
I think Dr. Field's initial comments were very good.
In that case, I'm going to, I think, sadly start to bring this to an end because we are getting near to our end. What I normally do is have each of the speakers give a final talk of another minute or so to conclude, and then I'll just talk about what's coming up. May I just reverse the order and have it Dr. Temin first, then Dr. Shlaes, then Dr. Field, perhaps a concluding minute or so.
Oh, no. Thank you for inviting me. This is all based on work I published 30, 40, 50 years ago, and always happy to revisit it. Thank you.
Professor Shlaes.
Thank you very much for a fun discussion. Please send me thoughts about the period before 1914, because that is the subject of my next book.
Well, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to talk to everyone and engage in our spirited discussion and try to respond to some of the questions. I think there may be some more overlap between our approaches, in the sense that I think like Amity, I also am interested in the supply side. I think I'm also, however, sometimes the supply side factors are more negative, and they're different from those that Amity emphasizes. Also, just concluding in terms of leading into the Second World War, I do accept the view that the Second World War, the massive fiscal and monetary stimulus, did close the output gap, as essentially, simple canonical Keynesian theory would predict, and probably Milton Friedman would have said the same thing. But what I think we're missing about the Second World War is that in fact, it was a period in which productivity fell very sharply in manufacturing. That is not what laid the foundation for the post-war prosperity. And so in that sense, I'm sympathetic to Bob Higgs's views on that. And so any of you who is interested in getting just a preview of some of the main themes on the extension of the story can look for the YouTube video of the Abramovich lecture, which I gave in December. So thanks very much, everybody. Appreciate it.
And thank you all. Thank you to our audience. Oh, excuse me, there's a phone in my background. Please ignore that. I want to say quickly, so thank you to all. This will be within 24 hours. I wanted to mention that my last question about the working class, that's credit to Radovich. So thank you, Mr. Radovich. That also, you can send questions to me, randall@nas.org, and I will be glad to forward them to the speakers. And then I just want to do a quick blurb for what's coming up next. We are having our next history webinar is, I believe, going to be February 1st. That's going to be on different aspects of the 1930s. And then we are going to have our next literature, Great American Literature webinar on the Red Badge of Courage on February 8th. They have a high bar to meet to equal this one, but we certainly hope they will. So we will be having more stuff, which I hope is as good as this, should be, with luck. And it's been wonderful listening and learning from all three of you. Thank you so very much.